was 11,557. Sie kommen Sie hier. That's how they called, called me.
My mom, she actually sacrificed herself because of the young daughter she had, and she couldn't take care of her and without giving us away. And so she stayed behind.
It's kind of difficult when when people, children or people ask me, how do you feel about never being able to see your relatives again?
It's important to share the story, because if you don't share it, then it didn't happen. It just didn't happen.
Well, I was born in 1930, and at that point we lived in the outskirts of Berlin, Germany. So at that point we moved into Berlin, center of Berlin. I still had a pretty normal childhood.
Jewish life was very much like everybody else. They all worked hard along, and children helped along to help their families sustain themselves.
When we first moved there, I was 4 or 5 years old. It was 1934, 35, and I would play with the children in the neighborhood. We used to play cowboys and Indians. About, I don't know, maybe by the time I was 6, maybe even earlier, they suddenly started playing Nazis and Jews. And of course, I had to be the Jew. And when I told my parents that, they said, well, that's it, no more playing with those kids. And I just couldn't play with them anymore.
In about 1938, anti-Semitism took off like a plane. It flew up high and grew tremendously.
Kristallnacht in 1938, I think it was in a Jewish school, but the school was attached to a synagogue. And of course, during Kristallnacht, they started burning all the synagogues. So all I remember is that all of a sudden my mother appeared to take me out of school, take me home. And I was kind of embarrassed. I didn't know really why that was happening. I found out later on it was because the synagogue was burning. I think my parents realized at that point, like many, many Jews at that point, realized that there was no going back. Things were not going to get better. This was the beginning, and they knew that things from then on were really going to be bad, and it was really time to get out.
By 1940, it was really turning very bad. 3 Hungarian gendarmes with their loaded guns and bayonets showed up on a Saturday at our door, and they ordered my father to start baking. My father tells him, he says, look, I have no customers today, I don't work today, and I have no need for bread today or baking products today. He says, I'm ordering you to start baking right now. And they lowered their bayonets, and he, of course, opened up the bakery and started baking, even though he had no reason for it, because they wanted him to violate his Sabbath. That was the bottom line. And they were ready to shoot him. I mean, it was a very serious matter. But this is the type of thing that went on. Jews were thrown out of trains, running trains. Some Jews had their beards cut or torn out, flesh and all, skin and all. I mean, there were more and more these daring and menacing and actual killing of Jews.
And I was about 3.5, 4 years old. And when the Germans came in, my family, I had a sister and my parents, they were killed. I was raised by an uncle of mine who also was in the vicinity. We were able to escape, and we lived in the woods for the next 4 years.
And Seichi Karoi explained to him that he had heard from reliable source that they're going to take us out of the country. They're going to take the Jews out of the country and drive us out and kill us, perhaps. Seichi Karoi came with a big load of hay loaded on his wagon, and he packed it so that we could hide in the middle of it. He had that hollow in the middle, and Seichi went back empty-handed because my father and mother believed that it just can't happen. It's just impossible.
The Germans, which is strange, the Germans who really hated the Jews, wanted to get rid of all the Jews, they still made it so difficult for them to get out. And these relatives, you know, were kind enough to give us affidavits, which means that they promised to take care of us if we needed it. If we didn't get jobs, they would take care of us. That was the only way you could get into the United States, by having somebody send you an affidavit. And of course you had to get visas to get out of Germany, but we finally did get the papers that we needed, but it took 4 or more years from the time my father first started to try to get out before we actually were able to get out.
What she told me was they loaded the Hungarian Jews on the boxcars, and they didn't know where they were going. The Germans didn't tell them where they were going, and they were put in concentration camp. Her family were probably thrown in the oven in the camp. They did not survive. Her mother and father and 5 siblings.
The next Sunday, the town crier came, as he usually comes, with a drum and with his list of things to read, the latest laws of the state, and he announced that every Jew must go to a roundup place and forced us into the ghetto or barracks house. My father, in his pain, before we left the house, he didn't know what to do to keep us together. He took that amulet, that shawl, and he cut it to 8 pieces. We were 8 of us there, 6 children and 2 parents, and he gave everyone a part of that, and he said, "This is an amulet from this and this rabbi, and it will help to protect you." Every week or so, they shipped off a whole bunch of Jews to Auschwitz. So we found out the hard way when it was our turn. The cattle train was just that. I mean, an empty train with some open areas on top of the train for some air. They gave us 2 buckets. 1 bucket with water and another bucket for waste. And that was our means of living there for 5 days. You can imagine 70 to 90 people, men, women, children, grandchildren, whatever, and grandparents all stuffed in and living off that 1 bucket full of water and 1 bucket for waste. It was unthinkable. But yet, that was the only thing we had. Father announced that whenever we are finished with this, make sure you write to Seichi Karoi and don't go anywhere else, just come home. In Auschwitz, when we got out from the trains, all of us still hung on to that amulet. However, we were soon separated. The men were separated from the women first. We had to form different lines. And of course, the Nazis were standing there with their guns and bayonets and with their German Shepherd dogs. Anybody that got out of line was beaten and the clothes torn off of them, or whatever happened. So there wasn't much you could do. I mean, we were in an army camp run by them, and there was not much you could do unless you want to get shot immediately. And we didn't want to do that in front of our parents because if we do something, our parents will get shot, or if they do something, we will get shot. You don't want the other one to get hurt, so you behave.
We knew they were rounding up Jews, and we were in hiding at that time in the house under the flooring. And we have heard what they do, you know. And basically some of the natives, which were not particularly friendly to Jews, they were just as bad as the Germans or the Nazis. And to the best of my knowledge, they took out the people and just shot them. My mom, she actually sacrificed herself because of the young daughter she had, and she couldn't take care of her and without giving us away. And so she stayed behind. I was raised by an uncle of mine who also was in the vicinity. We were able to escape, and we lived in the woods for the next 4 years.
The hunger, the thirst, the psychological pressure, the fear that your father, mother, brother, sister would get killed immediately was overwhelming. We were reduced to nothing but animals. We were really just moving pieces of flesh and blood. I mean, our minds weren't really working properly, and maybe that's the body's defensive motion to protect itself, because somehow automatically you still want to save yourself. Later that night and the next day, a few of the people who were there from before, they were pointing to a chimney down the line that says, you see, that's where your relatives are going through there. But most of us didn't want to believe it. Maybe for purposes of that we shouldn't lose faith, we shouldn't lose our humanity and our sanity. But most of us newcomers didn't want to believe it.
America was not in the war yet, but Great Britain was. So they were bombing Berlin, and we would have air raids almost every other night, every night. We would have suitcases packed, ready to go down. We were not allowed in the bomb shelter. Most of the buildings had underground bomb shelters, but the Jews were not allowed in there. So we were just in the front hall, big front hall of the apartment building with, of course, black shades over the windows. And we would hear the bombs, falling. Father and I, we were kind of the daredevils of the family. And so every once in a while, my father and I would sneak outside to look up and see what's happening. And, I remember we would look up at the searchlights. The searchlights were trying to get the bombers to shoot them down. And of course, we were hoping that they wouldn't shoot them down. They were British bombers, and even though the bombs might hit us, we didn't want the bombers to be caught in the searchlight.
You always had to scrounge for food, and we were helped by some farmers who were friends from previous times. But they were also in danger. If they were found out that they were helping us, they would have been killed. So, but somehow we just, my uncle and some of the other people just were able to get food for us to survive.
I was in the Auschwitz, Magdeburg, and Bergen-Belsen, 3 camps. I was working in the kitchen. I was pulling potatoes. It wasn't easy.
After my arrival, I was assigned to work on a construction crew. It wasn't your choice. We worked away at the camp there all summer long, and when autumn came, I just couldn't take the cold anymore. So I heard from someone that the coal mines, half or two-thirds of the people worked in coal mines, and in the coal mines the temperature doesn't drop below 60 something. And outside, of course, it went into zero. So I volunteered to go to work on a coal mine. In the coal mine, the work was very, very hard. Early January of 1945. Shortly thereafter, I lost my strength and I really couldn't go on working. So I went to the Krankenbau, which is like an emergency room, where there were 3 Jewish doctors, also Häftlinge just like myself, and they ate the same food, got the same treatment, but they, of course, they got a little better condition, and they worked in an emergency room as opposed to in the coal mine. So this guy orders me he says, "What's the matter with you?" So I told him, I've got my stomach hurts. So he ordered me to drop my pants, and he takes one look for a second. He says, "You have a hernia, go lay down." I was there for a couple of days, and suddenly we hear bombings and cannons from a distance. There were several soldiers there, former soldiers, Russian soldiers, because there were, the camp consisted of mostly Jews, but yet there were about 10 to 15% non-Jews there. They said the Russian army must not be far away. So they advised us to stay there because the Germans wanted us to go on the death march. So finally the decision was made that we're all sick, we can't go. And the Germans somehow bought into that, and they left us there, whereas the 99% of the camp left on that death march, in which they killed most of them. 80–90% of whatever was left from Auschwitz, now they killed them again on the road, because anybody that couldn't walk, it was a miserable January. 1945 January was a very difficult one. We remained there, and about 10 days later, the Russian army liberated us. We were liberated approximately, I believe, the 17th of January 1945. The war was still going on till May. They gave us some food, however. It said, we have a war going on, we can't be here, and we can't supply you, you're on your own. But we had no clothes, we only had that striped junk, whatever the Germans gave us. So I was in a big hurry because of my father's command that to go home and write to Sechikaroy.
There was some communication between the groups, or a friendly Polish man or woman told us that, that the war was over. When we were smuggled out from Poland in a truck to Germany. And once we got to Germany, we were able to get in touch. I believe their name was UNRWA, which they were taking care of the refugees. And we were placed in a refugee camp.
I decided to go to Krakow. Krakow was about 35–40 kilometers from Jaworzno, and I had a help from a Russian tank driver. He was driving, I don't know if it is a water or an oil tank. He was driving, and he let me get on top of his tank, and he took me to Krakow. So we decided to walk. It was a very dangerous, very miserable, and very stupid decision. When I got home, I was very, very sick, and I was fortunate to find my father's cousin home, who was in the labor camp, and his name was David Zeltzer, and he nursed me back to health because I was barely alive. Little by little, about 2 months later, 3 months later, one of my brothers showed up from one concentration camp. Then later another brother showed up from another concentration camp. Then another sister showed up from another concentration camp. Finally, in September, we got a letter. Sage Chikaro sent a letter into to us in Namene, in which our sister writes to him that she's alive in Bergen-Belsen, but she is recovering from typhoid fever, and that's it. So I volunteered. I went to pick her up.
I don't want to
We
remember.
got out in 1944.
And that's where I got freed, Bergen-Belsen.
Which we lived in about 3 displaced persons camps, DP camps. My uncle got married at that point, some point in time, and he had a daughter. Now his wife and his passed away. Now the wife had a previous child, so he couldn't take care of both of us. So he asked the what is today the United Nations to help him out. They put us in a children's camp, which we lived for about 6 months in. And we were giving a choice at that time where we want to go. And my social worker recommended that the United States was a great place. I said, okay, and because she also said my uncle and his daughter would follow us. Right, it was a big step, particularly when they told us we were going on a plane. Now, it's difficult to believe that a 13-year-old, or I was 12, at that time, was going to go on a plane to the United States, which was far, far away. And New York City with all those buildings, and it was a children's